Greetings! This presentation covers the Epicor Eclipse ERP, original ETerm Report Writer and Mass Load tool. As you explore Eclipse, you'll find that there are several predefined reports embedded in all of the functional areas of the menuing interface, and there's also some additional reports for management under the F8 Other. This, of course, is also accessible through Solar. All the reports work in Solar just the same, just a different interface. And even though each of the canned reports is very robust, there's a lot of parameters and columns you can specify, a lot of different functions, and you can schedule them as well. Invariably, there's going to be some things that you've thought up that they just don't do. And so the Report Writer tool, this original one, is where you go to scratch that itch of the special custom thing that isn't in the predefined reports. This tool is rather unique in that it is not just a reporting tool. It also can be used to do what's called mass loads or mass changes, where essentially you use this tool to create a query which pulls up a set of records, then allows you to use this interface to do mass changes rather than one-at-a-time changes. I have used that in the past, and I have found it to be not worth the effort. In most cases, it causes unanticipated resorts. Usually spend more time fiddling with the mass load tool than what it's worth. And I've discovered more sophisticated ways of doing mass changes. Still, though, having said that, there also is embedded in Eclipse, in the original ETerm interface, access to TCL. That's the terminal control language, and that allows you to talk right at the low level directly to the universe database and do your own queries and sorts and changes to the database using the PicBasic control language. This is obviously something you don't want to do unless you really have an excellent grasp of the whole structure of the Eclipse database. I don't know anyone that does. I wouldn't after 12 years even consider fiddling around with it, but it's there as another option. So Report Writer Mass Load kind of sits one level above TCL, the raw interface, and gives you some more elegant tools to do reporting with without having to learn programming. Eclipse over the years has developed another reporting tool. When you're running Solar, you access it, and this is a web-based Eclipse Reports tool, and it is pretty slick. It does some very quick and dirty, fairly elegant reports, but it is limited. It's designed to return small amounts of data, not vast amounts, and it's limited into what database files it can access and return data from. So the Report Writer allows you to do much more deeper level, much more sophisticated reports, and pull out larger amounts of data sets to do changes with or audits of your system. And of course, there are also third-party tools that can be purchased. I'm thinking of MITS in this case, where they export out vast amounts of data into their own custom web interface. They export the PicBasic data into a SQL database and then do some very sophisticated SQL querying and joins to give you, what do they call them, hypercubes for business decision making. Very powerful, but honestly it will cause all kinds of erratic extra problems with your system. So if you do decide to invest in MITS, keep in mind it's not cheap. Most of the information it gives you, honestly, you could do just as well with Report Writer and Mass Load and the tools that you have. And MITS will cause a substantial overhead on your system, and occasionally will gack things up for you. But management tends to like MITS because it gives them a nice Fisher-Price type of dashboard to access information with. Also, it should be mentioned that Universe has ODBC connector, and I believe at some conference some years ago I remember saying that it also creates SQL language logs, so there are ways of accessing the Universe database with other tools. That's an enhancement that you're going to have to pay extra money for, so odds are very few people, if anyone, will be using that. But anyway, those are all the variations of different reporting tools and accesses into the system that I'm aware of. But now that I've said it, now we can hit the reset button and go back to this one, the original report writer. In order to use the reporting tools, of course, you need to have some idea of the underlying structure of the database that you're working with. And so this will show you a listing of the common database files that make up Eclipse and what kind of data it usually specializes in. Without this, you're going blind. And here's a continuation of the list, and try and read through these as you can. I'd love to tell you that I was brilliant and discovered all this myself. No, this is just extracted from the Eclipse manual. And finally, here is the end of the list. I believe that there are more files in the database than just these. I think these are just the common ones that you report with. The other ones, I believe you don't access directly. They've done symbolic links in some type of way that allow you to get at the data in those other files through reporting on these in most cases. So these are just the ones that you need to know about. Here's a listing of the output formatting codes for when you generate reports, how you want some of the information to come out as. You don't often, or at least I don't very often, deal with the formatting. I've usually found it better off just to kind of pull a large amount of data out raw and then fiddle with it as I see fit in Excel. But that's entirely up to your taste. Of course, I realize you're not going to memorize all this. I just put them at the front before we start doing the presentation, getting in further, so you can refer back to it as needed. And finally, the last bit you should know when you're doing reporting is variable dating formatting. I realize none of this information I'm giving you at the front is going to make a stitch of sense. I just put it in the front, so after you get through doing the presentation, you can go back to it, do some screen captures, and have it available as needed on the front end. So bear with me, you'll probably refer back to these regularly. And now on with the show. The report writer can be accessed a couple of different ways, as I said before. If you're in Solar, you can go ahead and select it from the menu, and all it's going to do is pop the ETerm interface and auto log you in. And if you're already in ETerm, you can access it through F1 at mass load and through the GL reports selection. I think there's one or two other ways in the interface. I don't remember them off the top of my head. If you've inherited a legacy system, odds are there's already going to be some defined reports in place, and if you hit F10, it'll give you a listing of what's currently in the system, and you might want to poke around of what's in there currently for inspiration, if nothing else. I believe if you have a new implementation of Eclipse, there will be a couple of reports that are in there that just come with the system. I'm not sure if Epicor even remembers that those reports are in there. But it's always a good idea to look at what's in your system first before you go to add new stuff to it. Once you do decide to create a new report, and we'll keep in mind with this mass load thing, there's no way of importing or exporting reports out of the system. You can copy them once they're in the system and modify copies, but unfortunately there's not like an equivalent to a spreadsheet that you can click upload. That's rather annoying. So any report ideas, you're going to have to look at screen captures that someone has posted, like me, and type the stuff in manually. Sorry, that's just the way it goes. Anyway, the standard naming convention of reports is to start off by putting your initials, 2 or 3, whichever you like, a period, and then a brief descriptor of what the report does. And I think you've only got about 25 characters to work with, so don't be too verbose on the description. The whole reason for putting your initials and period first is to kind of separate out your reports from every other report that's in the system when you hit that F10 search. And here's the short list of the most common database files that you are likely to be writing reports on. And yeah, I realized previously there was a much longer list, but not very often are you going to actually be doing some of those rather extreme ones. These are the common types. And Eclipse separates their report categories into three. So you have static files, and that's of course not what it sounds like it is. Static database files do change. They just the information doesn't change that often. And there's the listing of what they consider the static files. Dynamic files are database files where the information changes quite a lot in the course of a day or a week. And so they're separated out in their own little way. They're still reported on the same way. I'm not sure why it makes any difference to know what's static and what's dynamic. And the third option, of course, is log files. And these are exactly what they sound like they are. They're where the log information. As I said in previous presentations, Eclipse is wonderfully obsessive with tracking everything that everybody does everywhere in the system. There's almost nothing I can think of you can do that there isn't an entry put in a log somewhere that tattles on you and tells someone that you did it. This is fantastic because over 12 years I can't tell you the number of times where people have come in and went, why did this transaction change? What happened here? And you go to point fingers and they say, oh, I didn't do it. And you pull up the log and yep, not only did you did it, you did it this time, you did it this date, and this is what it looked like before. And yep, they're caught red-handed. Fantastic to have. Anyway, so the log files can be reported on just like the other database files in the system. After you name the report, the next thing that you'll be putting in is the file name, and that's the database file. Refer to the lists that we just previously showed. The system will not let you go any further until you specify what file you're reporting on. And of course, on the next bit, be sure to, in the title, give some brief description of what the report is supposed to do. It comes in handy. As you start to construct your report, F10 is your friend. Of course, that gives you the search drop-down. If you just type in at least 3 characters of what the heck you're looking for, it'll shorten the list considerably the more you type. And most of the main files in the database have quite a lot of attributes to report off of, so you really have to dig through it. And even with all the years I've been creating reports, I don't have these blasted attributes memorized, so you do a lot of F10. Keep in mind when you're working in the ETerm interface, it's the reverse of solar, so escape means commit or save, F12 means abort. So keep that in mind as you go forward. Almost immediately after creating the first attribute record, which is usually the identifier to pull out the records, the record ID, as mentioned in the previous slide, this usually starts with an @ sign. Usually there's a couple of different attributes named differently that all point to the same thing, the same record ID for the file. Anyway, the report writer mass load starts in mass load mode view. You'll want to Alt-V it and switch it to report writer so you can see the headings and the width, because you want to adjust those, or when you go to print or download the report, it's going to look all kinds of funky because you don't have the widths and the headings properly set. So once you change the view, now you're going to be going and rewriting the column headings from the Eclipse suggested ones, and be sure that you put in enough characters width for your new heading, or else it's going to scroll down lines instead of across and look ugly. And the other couple of columns I should mention here that you're going to see in this view are the break and the totals, and this allows you to put in breaks or page breaks at this particular identifier as it prints, or whether if it's a numerical like a cost field, whether or not you want it totaled. I honestly have never felt the need to fiddle with this because this would really deal more with a report that you print, and I find that I almost never print a report. I usually generate it, and then I export it out and then put it in Spreadsheet. And I suspect you'll probably do the same. And of course, that final column there, format, that goes with the format codes there if you want to change the put a $sign on the number, if you want to add some more zeros, pad it this way or that, whichever. You've got all those wonderful format codes. Once again, in 12 years, I've never felt the need to use any of those, but there they are. And so, as mentioned before, as you populate the report with the different attributes that you want, you can hit F10 or type in the first 3 characters and hit enter, and you'll get a short list, and you can pick among it. If you don't have a helpful person like me to give you examples of reports, odds are you're going to spend an awful lot of time hunting and pecking. Each file in the database is likely to have hundreds of attributes. Some of the attributes are descriptors, they're pointers. So you may find 5 different names, but really they all reference the same piece of data. It's very, very annoying. Most reports that I've had to create over the years was hours and hours of trial and error because none of these attributes do what they seem to be named to do. So you end up having to experiment and run the report lots of times before you find that right combination of attributes that gives you the data that you want. And that's just par for the course. Usually you change the view back and forth between mass load and report writer a few times as you're constructing the report. And if you'll notice in the mass load view, you'll see next to width, you'll see a field or a column marked type, TYP, and you'll find usually D's or I's or all kinds of interesting symbols in there. And you may also notice as you're looking through the attribute list and adding attributes to your report, there's some interesting naming conventions. Usually at the top of the list there's attributes with @ symbols on them or $signs or that type of thing. Here's some explanation of some of that anyway. A D represents an actual data field. This points to a real actual piece of data that's stored in the database table or file in this case. An I is an interpretive field, and that may point to an actual data field. And they just have come up with a nickname for it. So you've got another name and points to the same thing. It may be a snippet of code that does some type of mathematical formula to construct a value at runtime. It may give some conditional statements for populating information. It might have some type of program logic, a small snippet of pick basic code that's generating something on the fly, or some type of translation. So the D's and I's don't really make a whole lot of import and for running reports. If you use this tool for mass load, obviously you can only do changes to fields that are D, data fields, not interpretive fields. And that's why they give you that little bit. And the @ symbol attributes, that's Eclipse says that these are internal variables, and that's being a little vague, but just basically keep in mind that thinking about how a universe database file is kind of set up, think of old numbered punch cards, if you're old enough to remember such things. And so this Eclipse ID would reference the number of one of the punch cards, and then you can read the data off that punch card, that type of thing. So the equivalent in SQL would be a record number in a table, and so that's why you use the @ID usually when starting the report. That's your reference of you're going to pull up each record in the file. If you're adding an attribute to your report and you want a little bit more information on it to format your report a little bit more cleanly, hitting Alt-E will pull up the Eclipse dictionary maintenance and give you all of the more formatting details of the attribute. If you find yourself flailing about while creating your report and you're picking attributes that just don't seem to be doing what you're thinking, if you do Alt-U and take a look at the dictionary summary, that might give you a little bit more inspiration. It very seldomly helps me, but good luck to you. Anyway, this will give you all of the attributes that reference to this particular file that you're writing your report on, and with a little bit of description, so it's a little bit more substantial than what you get off the F10 list, and you might be able to find that magic attribute off the list that you're looking for and weren't being able to find otherwise. The report writer allows you to add more things onto the list than just plain attributes. You can actually create calculated fields, as you see here with column 8, and this allows you to do some formulations, some adds, some adjustments as needed. I've never had a purpose to use this, but certainly it's there and certainly it's helpful. I usually find, since I'm exporting this to Excel anyway, it's easier for me to do formulas in Excel. But if you want to cheat and do it in here, so be it. It's got that option. Keep in mind it doesn't read like you'd think it would. Everything's got its own little convention to it. So what you see here is when you see just a raw number, that's indicating one of the columns, the data from one of the columns. And then of course you'll have a mathematical logic symbol, in this case asterisk for times. And the real numbers have to have a quote around them, or else it will think it's a column that you're referencing then. So in this example, what you're reading here is take the value that's pulled out by the column 6 attribute, multiply it times 100, and then put that on the report. And of course there's all kinds of fancier things you can do. By all means, feel free to read your Eclipse manual. It is possible to create a report that's a composite, using information from one file and a few attributes or fields from another file. It's not something that I often do because the results tend to be unexpected, and I usually spend more time trying to debug it and tinker with it than what it's worth. I usually prefer to pull data en masse out of Eclipse and then use other tools, scripts and programs to mash data together as I see fit. But anyway, it's possible. In order to make this work, you have to pick an attribute from the file you're in that happens to also be a key in one of the other files that's in the Eclipse database. And here our example, I'm going to use description, and you put in a / first, and that'll key the system that what you're typing in is going to be, hopefully, a key to another file. So I type in description, I hit enter, and lo and behold it brings up a sort list. It turns out description is a key into several other files and linked attributes, and I can select one of those other ones and pull the data in. Once I've done that, you'll see the attribute shows in that bottom screen there, it shows an exclamation point in front of it, and so it's a visual indicator that attribute, that data in that attribute is actually from another file in the system and not the product file in this case. Once you get through adding the attributes that you want into your report, and as you're adding them you may notice that the column data indicator will flash on and off as you go through the list. And this is telling you there's some additional refining information that needs to be added into the report in conjunction with that attribute. You'll notice next to the columns entries that there are asterisks occasionally. The asterisk is a reminder that there's that additional refining information that the attribute requires. As mentioned before, the universe database that underlies Eclipse is not a two-dimensional database like you expect with Excel and XY grid. It is a three-dimensional database. So you have the record, then you have the attribute in the record, then you have the position in the attribute. And so the column data is the way of specifying the position in the attribute that you want. If you pick the wrong position, you'll run your report, and even though you picked the right attribute, you'll end up with no data. This is very, very annoying. But to help you out a little bit, in almost all cases, the information that you're going to want is in position 1. But anyway, so here's an example of what we're meaning here. If you see in the lower right-hand section, here I have a product record in product maintenance. And here I'm pointing to the description entries. Descriptions can be several lines long, and that's stored as a multi-value. The attribute is description, but which line of the attribute is the position. So when I go into my column data, and for description, I put in the entry of 1, what I'm telling Eclipse on the report writer is, give me line 1 of the description in that record. And hopefully that will make some sense to you. It takes a little to get the hang of, but you will. Some attributes that you pull into your reports might have several pieces of additional refining information that they need to have in order to hone in on the right piece of data to put into your report. And here is a good example of one that you're probably likely to commonly trip across. Here we're looking at the product file, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to pull the purchase cost entry out and put it in the report. Now, the costing is kind of unique in that when your Eclipse system is installed, your installer and whoever is making the decisions on it may decide to use different naming conventions for the costing fields. And this is controlled with Priceline maintenance. And this is, if you look at the lower screen there, Priceline maintenance, you'll see what I'm talking about. Eclipse has Eclipse allows you to rewrite the costing names as you see fit. So trade service column 3, list price, rebate price, purchase cost, commission, calculated cost. These things can be named as is suited. Of course, for every price line, be sure you use the same names, or else you're going to have a mess. Now, the only other time you see those names is when you're doing product price maintenance, and that's why in the lower right here I have that open. Anyway, wouldn't it be nice if Eclipse was smart enough when I go to add attributes for that report that it knew the name that had been coded in Priceline maintenance to use for that particular field? Well, it doesn't. It sees all of them as just basis. So the only attribute I can select is basis, which references any of those basis names. So after I select the basis entry, then I have to go into column data, and I have to tell it which basis entry I'm wanting to pull from. So I know this is convoluted, but bear with me. So after we put in the basis, then we go into the column data window. Then we go in here and we see this is unusual. Now it's not just one position. Now I've got 3 pieces of refining information I have to give that attribute in order to get the data that I want. So I have to tell it what branch, because in Eclipse you could possibly have your system set that you're using different costing for different branches. My company doesn't do that, but it's possible. You want to tell it the effective date, and they harp on quite often in Eclipse that is a real-time timeline system. Every transaction you do and every report you run, of course, you have to keep in mind what time you ran it. So in this case, MODAYR just means give me the purchase costing as of today. And if you'll take a look in the lower right, the product price sheet maintenance, whatever the furthest right column that's going to show there is going to be, hopefully, if I do everything right, what pulls out of the report. Obviously, if I gave it a different date range, then it would slide that over in the price sheet maintenance and give me one of those previous prices of what was effective at that point in time. But that's not what I want. I want as of now. And then the final thing I have to do is the basis name, and as I said, we get that by going to the Priceline maintenance and taking a look at what the name is in the attribute. And that's all there is to it. It's kind of confusing, but once you do it the first time, it's pretty easy. So after we've got through adding the column data that our attributes require, now we want to go ahead and Alt-S for the selection builder. And this is where we're going to narrow down the report to a limited data set. So this is a filter. Usually when you get into this screen, the first entry, the add ID, is going to be in there by default anyway, and the first entry pretty much reads, give me every Eclipse record in this file that's not blank. And then you add your additional refining criteria from there with either AND or statements. And of course, as you're going through, as always said before, F10 is your friend. If you can't remember what it is you're wanting to do, what's valid in that field, hit F10 and it'll show you what refining selections you have there. So what we've done here in the final selection, for, which is the lower left, is we're working on the product file, and I've refined it. Give me every product record that there is in the product file, everything that's not blank, and every record that's got a status of at least under 4. And if you see here in the lower right hand, back in the product maintenance, in the status field, if you hit F10, you'll see what all the different statuses are. So what I've done is I've constructed a report that's going to show me all the products that are stocks, non-stocks, miscellaneous charges, but I don't care about deleted, reviewed, comment, purge, or temp or lot items. So that's how this is read. While you're in the selection builder, you may add additional filter attributes to reduce the number of records in your report, and one of those attributes might require some additional selection data in order for it to do its magic, and that's what's of course happened here in this example. I've added status in the selection criteria, and in order for status to work, it needs to know the status of the product record referencing which branch, because as we said in Eclipse, it is possible to have branches that have the same product but have different pricing, and Eclipse will keep track of that. But of course, when you go to run a report, then you'd have to do the report selection to make sure you're pulling the right values for that product record for that particular branch. In my company, since branch 1, the main branch, establishes all the costing and pricing, I don't have to fiddle with all that nonsense. So when I do Alt-S and selection data, I just put in branch 1 to run the report on, because it'll be valid across the company. If you've got a multi-branch company and it's doing different costing in different branches, God help you, your reports are going to look ugly. But you can do that. Anyway, if you forget to put this entry in, the only thing that's going to happen is when you go to run the report, it won't let you run it until you put in an entry for that multi-value position. Although you might be confused, if you're prompted with that, you might not know in reference to what, and you probably should go back and see what parameters you forgot to give it that's nagging you. Your selection data attribute entry can do compound selections. So as we're seeing here, I've changed the status, and instead of telling it give me every product that has a status of less than 4, now I've put in a parameter, a compound parameter here that says give me everything that's a status of either 1 or 3. I've never seen this used, but it's there. This is an example of the compare function for the selection criteria, and here we're seeing that I am taking whatever the data entry of the record for price line is and compare it to the attribute for the data entry for the buy line, and if the data that's in price line matches the data that's in buy line, then that record belongs as part of the selection. Here is an example and/or comparison function. Here I'm selecting records that may have a price line of Leviton or a price line of Cooper wiring devices. The selection criteria doesn't have to be hard values. You can also put wildcards. In this example here, I'm telling the selection to find every price line that starts with the letter L and make that part of the data set. This wildcard selection example will return every record that has a price line that ends with the letter O. This wildcard example will select any record that has the word wire contained in the price line. The reports can be set up to prompt the user at runtime for the selection criteria, making the report a lot more flexible. And so this is how you do it. Rather than hard coding or putting in a wildcard, in this case we're putting in a prompt, and that's just a word. You can make it any word that you want pretty much. It just has to be unique from whatever other prompts that you might have in this report, and it has to have a dollar sign on either side. So in our example, what I want is the user to be prompted for the status number. So ideally in this example they'd be putting in 4, and then the report would run for give me every record that has a status of 4, or that is stock, non-stock, as we showed earlier. So after we've gone ahead and put in our unique prompt and put the dollar sign on either side of it, then we go into edit prompts. Now, as we said before in the earlier slides, the status requires a refining entry for what branch, or else it won't operate. Now, in this particular case, I don't want the user to have to be prompted for the status number of 87654 and put in the branch as well, although I could. And that would be perfectly lovely, and there'd just be 2 entries that they'd have to put in at runtime. But in this case, since I've said all of my costing numbers are the same across all my branches, I've gone ahead of time and put in the selection data. I've already put 1 in. But when you do the edit prompts, it's, even though you've already pre-populated, it's going to show up anyway. Just ignore it. Ideally, the prompts that are automatically populated by Eclipse will not make a whole lot of sense to the users. You'll want to rewrite it. So in this case, I've gone ahead and rewritten the top line status and rewrote it to enter max status number to prompt the user. Hopefully they'll make more sense of that. I leave the second line alone because it's not even going to display, because I've already given it that information in the selection data. Then of course you can go ahead and hit Alt-B to test whether or not you've got the logic working properly on the prompt and it displays correctly, and you'll see the selection prompt. Just nice and pretty. And the last bit we'll want to do in our selection criteria is the sorting order, and that you go ahead and select Alt-T to get at that, and you can chain this together many levels as you want. Here in our example, I am sorting the selected records first by the price line in alphanumeric order, and then within the price line by description in alphanumeric order. After you've got the selection criteria all set up, you can go ahead and see what the end result is going to be by going ahead and selecting Alt-B for begin selection. And this will spit back in the count entry in the upper right hand corner the number of records that you can expect to see in the report using the criteria that you have gotten entered in. So if you want to whittle it down a little bit, now you can test it before you actually have to run the whole darn report and download it and see what the results were. So now that we're through constructing our report and we've saved it, now we can go ahead and run it. So you select Alt-R to run the report, and as we can see, we're immediately prompted with the prompt that we constructed for the selection criteria. we're going to go ahead and enter a 4 in because, as we said, we wanted to select products that have a status of stock, non-stock, and miscellaneous items, I believe it was. So that's 1, 2, and 3. Ordinarily, I would run the report immediately, and I would Alt-H to have it sent to the hold file, where I would download it to Excel at some later point. You could Alt-P to print it now. Within the print menu, you could also, rather than sending it to a printer, you could email it to yourself, and a couple other options, I think. I think it does FTP as well under there, and that's for immediate running. If you do Alt-O, now you've got a bunch of options that are usually employed when you're doing a scheduled report that's running on reoccurring. So you, under Alt-O, you do scheduling, and you go ahead and put in the schedule. In this case, say we wanted to run every Monday at 8 a.m. And then when it does that run, if you go back into options, you could put in an email address and have that report automatically email out every time it runs, and put in several or just one email address of whoever you want the recipient to. There's a couple other FTP and settings, but that's not often used. Within the system, if you don't want to email them out to several people, another option is to do forwarding. And if you schedule it and then set forwarding, what happens is when Eclipse users are logged in, when the report runs, it will show in their hold file just like it shows in your hold file, and they'll get a little notice, and then they can do whatever they want with it on their end from there. So you don't have to email them out, you can forward them within the system as well. Once the report is run and it's in your hold file, you can also go ahead and print it, email it, fax it, FTP it if you want, or forward it to other people after the fact if you hadn't already set those things up in the scheduler, if this was a one-time only thing. In our particular case, we're just going to do an Alt-L to download the file into a neutral format for import into Excel. Once you've done Alt-L and you've come up with a naming convention for the file and a location you want to save it to on your local computer, and be sure you, when you come up with the file naming, be sure you use the period and 3-letter extension at the end, like .csv, or else with Windows computers at least, Windows won't recognize what the file is, and it might be a little bit more difficult to find it and import it into Excel. Anyway, after you've named it, give it the .csv, pay attention to where you save it at. So there's nothing more embarrassing than going through the sometimes long-winded process of getting Eclipse to download the file to your local PC, and you didn't pay attention to where you downloaded it to. So pay particular attention not just to what you named it, but where you put it. After you've done that, before the downloading begins, you'll have to change the formatting. If you just want a text file to view, and a lot of times if I'm just doing quick reports and there's some particular piece of information I just want to scan real quick, I'll just download it as a text file. The standard formatting for text is the second entry, ASCII-LF equals carriage return line feed. Don't worry if you don't know what all that means. That just is going to produce a standard Windows readable text file that you can pull up in Notepad and look at. If you want to bring it into Excel, then go ahead and select Spreadsheet Reformat, and that's going to convert the report into a comma-separated value file, which is the standard, one of the standard imports that you can use in Excel. Do not worry if you run this. Eclipse reports in ETerm that you've set up will show up in your hold file in Solar just as well, and you can use the same download mechanisms to download it out of the system and into Excel from Solar. I believe the Solar download menu also has a tab separated format report if you want to do that instead, but don't hold me to that one. Anyway, if you've got a very large report, say 10 megs or so, don't be surprised that it takes up to 5 minutes for this thing to stream the download through ETerm to your local PC. Once I've downloaded the report to my local PC, I usually just open it up in Notepad and delete out the run information that the report puts in on the top of the header information. In the previous screen we suggested that you select add the header, and unfortunately it puts the run information on there too. So I want the header information, but I don't want the run information, so I open up a Notepad, I delete out the run information, leave the header information, save the changes. This happens before you try and do the Excel import. You don't have to do this part, but it makes everything a little cleaner. Go ahead and open a blank spreadsheet in Excel, and then go to Data and select From Text. Then go down to where you've located the file in your local computer and select it. The import wizard parameters are pretty straightforward. Make sure that you have My Data Has Headers checked if you selected downloading headers. Tell it it's delimited, tell it it's comma delimited, and at least in this particular report, since this report has UPC codes, and UPC codes often have zeros on them, and I don't want the zeros truncated, I select that UPC code field and set that as text so that it doesn't truncate all the zeros, because I want my UPCs to be nice 11 digits like they were intended. And if you've done everything correctly, you should be presented with a nice pretty spreadsheet with all of your data just as you wanted. And if you didn't get this, well, boo hiss on you. Now you're going to have to go back and figure out where you screwed up. And this pretty much completes our coverage of the Eclipse ETerm Report Writer Mass Load tool for doing basic reports with. If you feel like you've learned enough at this point and you can go experiment, then by all means you can stop here. What follows after this are several example reports using the various Eclipse database files. The reports are not terribly sophisticated, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what you can expect from the different common files in the Eclipse database, and may give you some templates that you can use to start expanding and doing your own reports with. As I said before, Eclipse doesn't have a mechanism for importing reports, if you will. You have to unfortunately hand key all of them in, but since I've put them on nice pretty slides, there's not that much typing. You should be able to do fine. Here's an example report for the Accrual register file, and this usually stores information on closed transactions in the system. That's things that are printed, among other things. There are a lot more keys here than what this basic report is showing. I'm just using an example here of a basic report of something that you might want to do. Here I've created a report that shows invoices for a particular date range. This report is used to give you a listing of the authorization keys. Those are the security keys that Eclipse uses. This would only be used by the systems administrator, but could be, and is a little list so you know all of the 1,485 different authorization keys that you have to set up in order for people to be able to do their work. This report is used to pull the information out of the bylines that you have programmed to your system. As said before in previous presentations, bylines and price lines kind of go together. See other presentations for further info. This report allows you to pull information on the control maintenance parameters. Control maintenance is once again used by the systems administrator and Eclipse to do customization tweaks to the behavior of the system. These usually, you don't go into changing these things lightly, and they're very convoluted. There are, I think, a couple thousand of them, and when you try and to find just which control is going to influence the behavior of the system, it can get a little daunting. Anyway, this little report might help. This report, it will give you a listing of, well, essentially all the attributes that are recognized by the Eclipse system. Probably not terribly helpful unless you want to program in TCL. In the Universe database, it's kind of confusing. You can kind of think of it as a blank numbered grid to start off with. and then it uses something called a master dictionary, and then it uses an Eclipse dictionary, and essentially they give names to the different numbered fields to construct the database and all the file structure with. If that makes any sense, hopefully. As I said, you'll probably never use this report, but there it is. Here's a report to show information on your customers and your customer records. Eclipse is kind of odd in that the customer and the vendor records both are in the same file. The file is called the entity file, and when you create these reports you use the attribute VC to determine whether or not you're pulling records that are customer records or if they're vendor records. This report gives you vendor information. It's pretty much a mirror image of the customer information pulled off the entity file. Same rules apply. Here's a variation on the customer report. This one allows me to pull the contracts that are assigned to the particular customers. Here's an example general ledger report. This one is just giving me a listing of all the general ledger accounts and their basic settings. The initials file is going to be able to give you a report on the authorization keys, templates, and menus that are assigned to your users in the Eclipse system. Eclipse uses, as I said, about 1,480 some odd authorization keys with different levels of security to allow people to do or not do whatever they need to do in the system. Since it would be extremely unwieldy to pull a subset of 300-400 keys out to assign to each user, what you usually do is you put all the keys at the appropriate security levels together into one template, and then you assign the template to the user. So this example report here gives you some idea. And of course, in order to add additional levels of functionality for a user, you can apply multiple templates, and all the security authorizations are cumulative. With the menus, Eclipse, in their brilliant thinking, they thought that, well, the best security to have is to not even allow users to see certain parts of the system. And that's why for every job function you usually have a different menu that's set up. So when one person logs in for accounts payable, they would not see the same options even to select that someone that's an outside salesman would. And so there are custom menus that are created and assigned in this as well. Anyway, so that's what that report helps you look through and manage. The matrix file is going to be used to create reports on your pricing matrix. And this, well, pricing matrices can get very ugly, and certainly pricing matrix reports can get equally ugly. This is a very simple report where I am just taking contracts that we have in place that have a hard dollar value, which you're never supposed to do. See future presentations that we're going to have on pricing matrices, but you're not ever supposed to put in hard dollar values, but people do. Anyway, so this little report here allows me to pull up the entries in a particular contract and show me what the values are. This report helps you pull information on your price lines so you can audit them and make sure that you have all your price lines set up properly and that you've entered all your basis names in consistently across all of your price lines. This report is just information on the products in your product file, and this is just a more robust version of the example report that we created earlier in the presentation. This is a variation of the product file report. This will give us the product location in the warehouse and the on-hand balance for warehouse 1. This report uses the psub file, and according to the big book, this is for closed ledger transactions, or in translation that means sales orders and purchase orders and adjustments and other things that have been posted. They're done. So this is historical information on transactions. This report is another good one for the system administrator, and this goes ahead and gives you the basic information of all the reports that are currently scheduled or about to run or running in your system Phantom. This is another administrator report of dubious use. This just gives you the basically the contents of what's inside people's hold files that they haven't deleted yet. This report gives you information on your tax jurisdictions. This one's very handy when you have to keep adjusting your tax rate every year, thanks to your wonderful state of wherever. This report gives you the information on your terms codes that you have programmed into your system and their basic settings. This report was more play than use. This deals with the call tracker that's in the system. Take a look at the presentation on the messaging and tracker system for more detailed information of what all that is. And this just pulls out the basic information on trackers that haven't been deleted or purged yet in the system. This report gives you basic information on your zip codes that you have programmed in your system. This is used in conjunction with the tax jurisdiction report because, well, if your state's anything like mine, every so often they decide to put zip codes in different territories, change different city boundaries and such, and so you can't just change the tax rate. You have to actually review the zip codes and make sure the zip codes are assigned to the right jurisdictions. And that completes all the example reports that I had time to put together. Topics not covered. There is another level of doing reports, and I've never had an interest or need to go that farther into it. But yes, you can do very complex math, string manipulation, and even build basic program logic operations. And the way to do this is by building I descriptors. It's a very tricky and complicated subject, and that's good material for another presentation if I feel like banging my head on the floor anyway. It's complicated. Yes, as I said before in the beginning, the report writer can be used not only just to give you, show you the information as it's set in your system, but you can make changes to that information as well using the same tool, and that's when you have it in mass load mode. As I said, I wouldn't recommend using this because it tends to be more aggravating to set up, and it has unanticipated tricks. It sounds more useful than it is, but in my case I've found it to be more like trying to swat a fly with a sledgehammer. Yeah, and as I said, there are more elegant and detailed ways of making changes in your system en masse, which I will cover in other presentations. And this completes our presentation on the Eclipse Report Writer Mass Load tool. And if you think this was a long one, try writing it. Anyway, thank you for your attention. I hope this has been useful information for you. And if not, apparently you're some kind of sadomasochist. Thank you again. And as always, I am not Scott Zahn.